Welcome to our Holmes History Lecture Series. My name is Jay Wilson, and I am an online history instructor with Holmes Community College. I will be giving you a short lecture on the Spanish-American War for your US 2 class. Please pay close attention to the information in this lecture. There will be a quiz at the end of the video. Beginning in 1492, after sponsoring Christopher Columbus's expeditions, Spain became the first European nation to sail westward across the Atlantic Ocean, explore and colonize the Amerindian nations of the Western Hemisphere. At its greatest extent, the empire resulted from this exploration extended from Virginia on the eastern coast of the United States, south to Tierra del Fuego at the tip of South America, and westward to California and Alaska. Across the Pacific, it included the Philippines and several other island groups. By 1825, much of this empire had fallen into other hands or become independent. The only remnants of the empire in the Western Hemisphere were Cuba and Puerto Rico, and across the Pacific, the Philippine Islands, the Carolinas, Marshall, and Mariana Islands, which included Guam. Following the successful independent movements of mainland Latin America, Cuba launched its own struggle for independence. Between 1868 and 1878, Cuban guerrilla forces fought for autonomy from Spain in what is today known as the 10 Years' War. That war concluded with a treaty that promised some freedoms for the Cuban people, but it was never actually enforced. By the 1890s, Cubans had once again begun to agitate for their freedom from Spain. The unofficial leader of this struggle was Jose Marti, who established the Cuban Revolutionary Party on January the 5th, 1892 in the United States. Marti was a gifted writer and speaker, and his pleas for Cuban independence had been moving to many Americans. After the outbreak of fighting on the island, Marti returned to Cuba and participated in the first few weeks of the armed struggle, where he was killed on May the 19th in 1895. Now, U.S. interest in Cuba had begun long before 1898. There had been several schemes by the U.S. to purchase Cuba from Spain, but none had actually come to fruition. Still, by 1890, American sugar interests had bought up large tracts of land in Cuba. American sugar plantations and processing facilities were scattered all across the island. By 1898, the U.S. had more than $50 million invested in Cuba, and annual trade, mostly in sugar, was worth twice that much. The fighting in Cuba had begun to threaten those investments, and many American business interests had begun to pressure the U.S. government to intervene in the war. Fervor for American intervention in the war had been growing in the United States, despite President Grover Cleveland's proclamation of neutrality on June the 12th, 1895. But sentiment to enter the conflict grew in the United States when General Valeriano Weyler began implementing a policy of reconcentration that moved the population into central locations, or concentration camps, according to most American newspapers. Then, in February of 1896, he placed the entire country under martial law. American newspaper coverage inflamed the American public's opinion of the Spanish treatment of Cuba through the extensive practice of yellow journalism. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, two of America's most successful newspaper owners, encouraged their reporters to write lurid, sensational, exaggerated, and sometimes outright false stories about the terrible conditions in Cuba. When President William McKinley was inaugurated on March the 4th, 1897, he was more anxious to become involved than Grover Cleveland had been, especially after the New York Journal published a copy of the Delome letter. This letter from Spanish Foreign Minister Enrique Dupuy de Lome was critical of the new American president, calling him a bidder for the affections of the crowd, among other things. Partly in response to the Delome letter, McKinley sent the battleship Maine to Cuba to protect American interests there. The Maine was one of America's new, all-steel, steam-powered warships and was only about 10 years old. On the night of February 15th, the Maine mysteriously exploded, killing 260 American sailors. Most experts believed that it had been caused by an accident, But Teddy Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at that time, proposed that it could have been a Spanish mine or torpedo. Newspapers ran with this story, and the American people were whipped into a war frenzy. By the way, today it is generally accepted that the explosion was an accident that occurred when the gunpowder magazine, which contained about 5 tons of gunpowder, caught fire. But in 1898, nobody wanted to hear that. Events moved swiftly after the explosion. On March the 9th, Congress passed a law allocating $50 million to build up military strength. Almost 100,000 men had volunteered for military duty the day after the mine exploded, and eventually the Army enlisted 220,000 soldiers to fight Spain. On April the 21st, President McKinley ordered a blockade of Cuba, and 4 days later the U.S. declared war. Following its declaration of war against Spain, the United States passed the Teller Amendment, asserting that the United States had no intention to take or annex Cuba. Just 2 days later, Commodore George Dewey sailed from Hong Kong for the Spanish Philippines. Fighting began in the Philippine Islands at the Battle of Manila Bay on May the 1st, where Commodore Dewey and a small American flotilla destroyed the Spanish fleet under Rear Admiral Patricio Montojoy. However, Dewey did not have enough manpower to capture Manila until 15,000 additional troops arrived from America at the end of July. On the way to the Philippines with these reinforcements, the cruiser Charleston stopped at Guam and accepted the surrender from the Spanish governor, who was unaware his nation was even at war. Fighting did not begin in Cuba until June of that year, when the Marines captured Guantanamo Bay and 17,000 troops landed at Daiquiri, just east of Santiago. At that time, Spanish troops stationed on the islands numbered 150,000 regulars and 40,000 irregulars and volunteers. U.S. troops attacked the San Juan Heights outside of Santiago on July 1st, 1898. Dismounted troopers, including the African-American 9th and 10th Cavalries and the U.S. 1st Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, also known as the Rough Riders, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, attacked Kettle Hill, while forces led by Brigadier General Jacob Kent charged up San Juan Hill and pushed Spanish troops further inland, inflicting some 1,700 casualties. While U.S. commanders was deciding on a further course of action, the Spanish fleet tried to escape from Santiago Harbor, only to be soundly defeated by the U.S. Atlantic Squadron. On the 16th of July, the Spaniards agreed to the unconditional surrender of all the Spanish troops around the city, and Cuba was technically in the possession of the United States. A few days later, U.S. forces sailed from Guantanamo to Puerto Rico. These forces landed near Ponce and marched to San Juan with virtually no opposition. At San Juan, they accepted the surrender of all the Spanish forces in Puerto Rico and occupied the capital city. By August, fighting had practically ended, but it took several more months to formalize the official end of the war. Representatives of Spain and the United States finally signed a peace treaty in Paris on December the 10th, 1898, which established the independence of Cuba, ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, and allowed the victorious power to purchase the Philippine Islands from Spain for $20 million. The war had cost the United States $250 million and 3,000 lives, but it earned the United States its place as an imperial power. As John Hay put it, this had been a splendid little war for America.